Okay, hi everybody. Good to see you. And I was in Tzfat this past Shabbos. That's why I used this, remembering the configuration of the Batei Knisiot. So today we have a very, very fascinating parsha, very difficult parsha, and once again, the ultimate difficulties I'm not necessarily going to be able to explore. I know that you have some interesting essays on it. The concept of people who are given certain powers, apparently by God, the power of blessing, the power of curse. And it's clear the way the Torah describes Bilam, it's kind of a magical way, because Balak, now maybe Balak is not a 100% reliable witness, but Balak, the king of Moab, says about Bilam, whomever you bless is blessed, whomever you curse is cursed. Which is interesting. We commonly think that Bilam only has power in the negative direction. Apparently he has power in the positive and the negative direction. And indeed, you can actually see that, because when God changes his curse into a blessing, he's using Bilam as the instrument to bless Am Yisrael. The concept of why a person would be given this idea of blessing and curse, and where does it come from? Obviously, there is no rival power other than God, so everything must come from God in one way or the other. We do not believe in an antichrist, or even Satan is not considered a demonic force that is against God. Rather, I think, as I said in another shiur, the very word Satan or Has-Satan is not a proper noun at all. It is a job description. Has-Satan means the accuser. He is part of God's heavenly court, and his job is to prosecute, and he's doing his job when he points out all of our failures, all of our flaws. So we do not believe there's a concept of a demonic force that is somehow in opposition to God. So whatever Bilam does is coming from God. And Chazal give us a partial explanation. They point out that the Umot HaOlam would complain to Hashem, if you would have given us a prophet of the greatness of Moshe, we too would have been righteous. So you can't say anything against us. So God says, I will give you a prophet equal to the greatness of Moshe, and that is Bilam. Now, of course, why can't they argue back? Hey, you gave us a bad guy, right? You gave us a person with all sorts of negative attributes. If you would have given us a person who was righteous, the same argument, we would have been righteous. So it seems to be from that Chazal that Bilam and Moshe started the same way. In other words, the evil of Bilam was not something that he always had, but rather the tremendous power he was given led him astray. So essentially, Moshe and Bilam are two people who start off at point zero. They are given extraordinary powers. One uses them for good and becomes righteous and holy. The other becomes intoxicated with his power. So God gave the Umot HaOlam a person equivalent to Moshe, and because of the idea of Bechira, of human choice, a person could take his powers and use them in a very, very destructive way. So it's quite remarkable that essentially Chazal are telling us Bilam and Moshe are made of the same raw stuff, so to speak, and they both were given extraordinary supernatural powers. And what do you do with the powers that Hashem gives you? But let me start off, we'll come back to this, but let me start off with a preliminary question. Remember, let's be sure we have the historical situation here. This is the 40th year of the wandering in the desert. This is very shortly before Moshe dies. Aharon and Miriam have already died. Moshe is still around for a little bit longer. And they are east of the Jordan River. Of course, they're going to cross it when Moshe dies, and Yehoshua will lead them. And they want to seek passage through the land of Moab. And the Moabites said no, but that was not sufficient. Balak is fearful of the Jewish people, and he hires a sorcerer, Bilam, to curse them, which is a way of destroying them. So the Mefarshim ask a very simple question. God commanded Moshe Rabbeinu explicitly that if the Moabites do not give you permission to pass through their land, you are not permitted to wage war with them. You are not permitted to attack them. You are not permitted to harass them. Moab comes from Lot. And in a sense, therefore, there's a certain merit of Abraham that is still there, and their land is their land, and we are not allowed to take their land.
Where is that prohibition?
This is in, it's actually not in this parsha, but it's in Deuteronomy. When Moshe Rabbeinu reviews these events, he mentions that God commanded him not to wage war or harass the Moabites. So if that's the case, Balak has no reason to be afraid at all, because the Jews are not going to wage war against him. They're not going to take his land. They are commanded by God not to do anything.
How would he know?
Right. So one possibility in Pshat might simply be Balak just didn't know that information. On the other hand, one could assume that perhaps Moshe communicates that we are not here as aggressors, we are not here with any hostile intent, we want to buy food and drink, and we want safe passage, and if you deny it to us, then we'll just have to go around and find another exit, which in fact was the case. So the commentaries ask the question, what was Balak's motivating fear that he goes out of the way to hire a sorcerer, Bilam? So it's very, very interesting that the Shem Mishmuel, one of the great Hasidic Sfarim, offers an explanation that may be a little bit homiletic. And he says the following. He says, Balak was not concerned that the Jewish people would wage war against him. Balak was concerned that the Jewish people would reach Eretz Yisrael, and that he didn't want them to do. What's the problem? Because, once again, let's compare the existence of the Jews in the desert with the existence of the Jews once they come to Eretz Yisrael. In the desert, we spoke about this a number of times, they are living in a hermetically sealed spiritual cocoon. The man comes from heaven. The traveling water follows them. They are surrounded with clouds of glory. The presence of God is palpable, obvious, clear, undisputed. They live a life of miracles. Now that type of life has costs. When you're living in the presence of God in that intense way, then every misstep will have very, very serious consequences. But still, the revelation of God is manifest and clear. Once they come to Eretz Yisrael, life is going to be very different. There will not be man, they're going to have to plant their fields. There will not be traveling wells, they'll have to dig wells and look for rainwater. And of course, the clouds of glory are not going to be there either. They're going to have to build cities. They're going to have lawyers and doctors and accountants and professional soldiers. And there's going to be what is called Hester Panim, a great concealment of the divine. And that can have different consequences. That could result on one extreme to a loss of confidence, in which we're so afraid. Remember, we spoke about that may have been the sin of the spies. Or conversely, it could lead to arrogance, in which I think I'm in control of my fate and my decisions. I don't need God. This is the attitude that the Torah itself warns us against. Kochi v'yotzim yadi. My strength has done all of this. So Eretz Yisrael has many challenges. But on the positive side, what Eretz Yisrael establishes is the ability to create a society in the physical and material world that is based on the morality and the commandments of God. And there is no necessary dichotomy or inconsistency between spirituality and dwelling in the material world. So here's what the Shem Mishmuel says. Balak is quite happy to have a spiritual nation, not living in the real world. Let them serve God with their man, with their well, with their clouds of glory. There's no message for us. We live in the real world. We live in the world of war, and we live in the world of commerce, and we live in the world of business, and we live in the world of day-to-day distractions. So we have to do what we have to do. And they are not a reproach to us. They are not a precedent to us, because they are not living the life of Olam Hazeh. But once the Jewish people come to Eretz Yisrael, where there is the potential to bridge the spiritual world and the physical world, and to show that holiness can exist even in the atmosphere of the gashmiyut, of the physicality and materiality of Olam Hazeh, at that point all of the defense mechanisms of the Umot HaOlam now collapse. So the Shem Mishmuel said that Balak's kavanah was, by all means and in all ways, we must prevent the Jewish people from reaching the land of Israel. If I can't do it militarily, I'll get Balak to do it supernaturally. So the fear basically was that Balak was happy for religion to be an ethereal, otherworldly force having no connection to the so-called realities of life. Because at that point it becomes irrelevant. It has nothing to do with us, with them. Mashain Cain, once they enter Eretz Yisrael, at that point it will be established, at least in the best case scenario, that spirituality and service of God can exist within the confines of a physical and material society. That is what Balak wanted to prevent. You know, it is said, Theodor Herzl, when he drew up plans and he wrote his classic book, The Jewish State, which was his prediction and his ground plan, his business plan, so to speak, for a future state of Israel. He didn't use the word Israel. The question, what would the state would be called? That itself was a big question. So Herzl was asked at one point what the role of religion would be in the state. And the quote, at least that is attributed to him, is, "We will confine the rabbis to their synagogues as we will confine the army to its barracks." Neither part of that prediction has been carried out. Unfortunately, of course, to our sadness, the army has not been confined to its barracks. It has had quite a lot of work to do in the years since 1948. And the other side of the equation, the rabbis have not been confined to their synagogues. You can take that as good news or bad news. I will leave it to your judgment. I won't get into that. But that part of the sentence has not been fulfilled either. And in many ways, the idea of rabbis and politics, that's a separate subject. That's not the subject I'm really addressing. But the concept that we have to bring ruchniut, we have to bring spiritual values, even into our material lives, is a very, very significant idea. Because one of the teachings of Judaism is we don't regard the material as evil. We regard it as neutral. And we can engage in every aspect of the world in a positive spiritual way that sanctifies God. And indeed, in the Baal HaTanya's famous formulation, which is not his original words, but it's often attributed to him, although it actually is the lashon of the Medrash, it is God's greatest yearning to have a dira b'tachtonim, that means a dwelling place, specifically in the darkness and lowliness of this world, as opposed to simply being acknowledged in holy, spiritual places. Rather, we bring God into the marketplace. We bring God into our family relations, into the raising of our children, into the way we conduct our businesses. That all of this has to have the gushpanka, it has to have the imprimatur of holiness and closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it was this that Balak was not able to tolerate. Balak could tolerate a religion that was divorced from life, because that had no relevance to him. He did not want a religion that would be integrated with life. And that is really, if you think about this, this is the ultimate religious Zionist vision, the Dati Leumi vision. Again, it's often very imperfectly realized in many, many ways, but the concept of the Dati Leumi vision certainly is articulated by both Rav Kook Sr., Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen Kook, and by his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, was the idea that Eretz Yisrael is a material entity. It's an entity in which we build, and we have an army, and we have businesses, and we have agriculture. But the idea is to bring holiness into the physical dimensions of life, and not limit holiness to so-called holy activity like learning and davening, but to understand that digging ditches and irrigating fields also have a certain dimension of holiness in them. And that was the aspect of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, not to have a dichotomy between ruchniut, between the spiritual, and the chumriyut, or the gashmiyut, the material and the physical. And Balak wanted to keep that dichotomy. This is the Shem Mishmuel's comment why Balak wanted to have Bilam curse. But now let's go back to Bilam. Of course, the Chofetz Chaim makes another interesting point. It's interesting that if Bilam has the power of both blessing and curse, why does Balak have to hire Bilam to curse? He ought to hire Bilam to bless his nation, that his nation will be successful. The Chofetz Chaim says that is the nature of evil people. They only want to harm, meaning to say, they don't even think of getting themselves benefit. It is almost an automatic response that they want to tear down others rather than build themselves up. And that is why Balak instinctively moves in the direction of curse instead of the direction of blessing. It's interesting, they say, the Chafetz Chaim was also said as a righteous person to have a certain power that whatever he said, Hashem would agree to. This is expressed by Chazal's statement, Tzaddik gozer v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu Makayim. The Tzaddik decrees and God listens. Now in this connection I want to mention two little stories about the Chafetz Chaim, about this particular mimer. After the Chafetz Chaim died, his son, Rav Aryeh Leib, who himself was a great Talmid Chacham, was asked, surely there are many instances of the Chafetz Chaim decreeing things, whether it was giving a bracha to a chola, or to a woman who needed children, or through a marriage, or for parnasa. Can you give us some good examples of tzaddik gozer? He decreed, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Makayim. So Rabbi Leib said a very, very beautiful thing. He said, I'm sure there may be some examples of my father, the tzaddik, decreeing and God listening. But I want you to know, my father was much more interested in HaKadosh Baruch Hu gozer, but tzaddik Makayim. He was much more interested in God decreeing and the tzaddik listening than he was in the tzaddik decreeing and God listening. It wasn't about giving orders to God, it was about being an obedient servant of God. Interestingly enough, lahavdil, I found a very parallel, very similar quote from Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln was in a cabinet meeting in the middle of the Civil War, and in those days people did mention God in politics. It wasn't like today. And his cabinet said, one of his cabinet members said to him, Mr. President, we shall surely win because God is on our side. And President Lincoln responded, it's much more important that we be on the side of God than God be on our side. The point is not, let's enlist God to our agenda. The point is, let's try to be sure that our agenda is in accordance with God's will. And those of you that like American history, if you haven't read it, I'm sure, well, if you like American history, you probably have read it. I urge you to look at Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is actually quite a profound Musar Shmuz about the idea that God eventually punishes the evils that people do, and we have to repent. He called upon the United States to repent for slavery, repent for the harm, and he said that the Civil War was essentially God's punishment for the way we treated other human beings. It's a very, very moving. And he didn't blame the South, so to speak. As he said, he said the whole American people, the whole nation, must repent. And this is kind of God's punishment. This is what he saw. He saw all of the tragedies that were happening. Okay. Yeah.
Still in progress?
The war was still in progress. Yes, it was. Lincoln's second inauguration was in the middle, or at least the latter third of the war. The war still went on for 1 or 2 years after that. Okay. And anyway, so that's one point that Chafetz Chaim made about, or his son made. The point is not to decree things to God, but to kind of accept God's decrees. The second point that the Chafetz Chaim made is, because he did have this power that God listened to him, so people would sometimes come to him and they would ask him to curse out evil people, curse out the Tsar, curse out various people. And the Chafetz Chaim refused. The Chafetz Chaim said he doesn't use the power of curse. He only uses the power of blessing. He says he doesn't even want to curse evildoers, because cursing is not the way you emulate God. God wants to bless, and one should not take the path of curse, even towards those who, in some level, we would, hope would be destroyed and not have power anymore. Okay, but now the Chafetz Chaim makes another point. In the Torah, if you look at a Sefer Torah, you will notice that the Torah is broken up into paragraphs. There are paragraph divisions in the Torah. In fact, those are called parshios. In fact, when we call something the parsha of the week, that is actually a misnomer. The technical term parsha does not mean the weekly Torah reading. The term parsha actually means a paragraph in the Torah. And the paragraphs are divided into two ways. Sometimes, if a paragraph ends in the middle of a line, and the next paragraph begins on the next line, so the rest of the line is vacant, is blank, that is called an open paragraph, a petucha, because the whole line is left open. Other times, the next paragraph begins on the same line with a break of 9 letters, 9 blank, a space equal to 9 letters, and that is called a parsha setuma, a closed parsha. Now, one might not automatically see the importance of this, but let me point out, halachically, these divisions are extremely important, ad kedei kach, that if a Sefer Torah does not have the right division of petuchot and stumot, even though it doesn't change the meaning of anything, the whole Torah is puzzle. The Torah is puzzle if the petuchot and the stumot are not accurate. They were transmitted at Sinai. So every parsha of the Torah has a mixture of petuchot and stumot. There is no parsha of the Torah that is unbroken text. Every parsha is broken up in some way or the other. The only exception is Parshat Balak, that the whole story of Bilam is an unbroken block of text that has neither a petucha or a stuma. Later, at the very end, after Bilam went home, so the end of the parsha is already another paragraph. But the whole story of Bilam is unbroken. Is there any particular significance to the notion that Bilam is a block of unbroken text? So here's what the Chofetz Chaim suggests, a very, very interesting idea. The Medrash tells us, what is the purpose of the breakup of text, either petucha or stuma? This is the way God communicated to Moshe, that when God would communicate to Moshe, he would give Moshe breaks between commandments, so Moshe could do whatever he had to do. And if it's a stuma, it was a relatively shorter break. If it was a petucha, it was a relatively longer break. We don't really have a log of what Moshe did during his off time, but we'll see, it really wasn't off time. But the petuchot and the stumot, the breaks, represent what is called revach, space, bein hadveikim, between the attached psukim and the like. Now, the Chofetz Chaim wants to explain that the concept of revach does not mean a break, a vacation, a nap. Moshe did not need naps or coffee breaks or the like, but rather, revach bein hadveikim meant that Moshe was the leader of 3 million people. And they had needs and they had demands. Moshe could not spend the whole day talking to God. So God would speak to him for a while. Then Moshe would have to do whatever he did. Maybe it was hours, maybe it was days. And then he would return back to God. So the Revach indicates that Moshe is going back and forth from prophetic mode to activist mode. The Revach indicates activist mode. He has to deal with a problem, put out a fire, calm down people, give counseling for Shalom Bayit, whatever Moshe Rabbeinu did. And then he would go back and talk to God. If you think about that, that's quite an extraordinary accomplishment. Because normally, once we're in one particular modality, it's extremely difficult to disengage into the other modality. You know, if you're in a prophetic, ecstatic state, how do you then start dealing with, people complaining about this or that? And the other way around, if you're involved in the day-to-day distractions of dealing with multitudes of people, how do you get back into this ecstatic, divine communion with the Almighty? How do you move? How do you navigate between these different types of modalities? The answer is, to the tzaddik, these are not different things. Everything is serving God. Everything is bringing holiness into the world. One way you do it is through prophecy, through Torah study, through meditation. The other way is by changing diapers, running carpool, building up the land, digging ditches. So the tzaddik is able to navigate between these types of experiences, because all of these experiences are fundamentally the same thing. They are simply different aspects of bringing glory to God. That goes back to the gashmiyat, the physicality, and the ruchniyat. And that is why Moshe could move from prophecy and communion with the Almighty to dealing with the mundane challenges. They say with Rav Moshe Feinstein, if you ever read his tshuvot, his responsa, they are extremely intricate and detailed and very, very complicated. Even great rabbis often have difficulty following the density of his thought and his argument. Now, Rav Moshe used to sit in the Beis Medrash of MTJ, the Scepter Tiferet Yerushalayim. That was his yeshiva on the Lower East Side. And he spent all of the free time that he had, whatever that was, writing. He would be writing his very intricate talks, but he was constantly interrupted with all of the questions that Rav Moshe Feinstein was interrupted with. Now, these were not just halachic questions. These were shalom bayis questions. These were questions of terminal illness. These were questions of tragedies. And he came, and people record, and I knew Rav Moshe a little myself as well when I was very young, that as busy as he was, when you spoke to him, you actually felt you were the only person in the world. There was never a sense that he was in a rush. There was never a sense that he wanted you to finish up the story so he can go on to something more important. You were the focus. By the way, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very much the same way. We had the Rebbe's Yortzeit this past Shabbos, Gimel Tammuz. And again, the concept would be that when they were dealing with a fellow Jew, that Jew was the most important person in the world. And then when they dealt with the next Jew, that person assumed the role of most important. And Rav Moshe would sometimes have to interrupt his writing for 6 hours. And then, when he went back to his writing, he was able to assume where he was in the middle of a sentence, sometimes in the middle of a word. Now, the problem is, his thought was so dense and so complicated. Like, how do you just get back into it? You would need time, a half an hour kind of, to get back into the sugya, so to speak. But the answer is that for these Gedolim, there are no such things as discontinuities in life. Everything is continuous. And therefore, going back to the Chavetz Chaim, Moshe could move back and forth between the Olam HaGashmi and the Olam HaRuchani because it was all the same from his perspective. Bilam, on the other hand, was a creature of mood. So when Bilam was in the spiritual mood of prophecy, he couldn't get out of it. Like an alcoholic, he was kind of intoxicated by prophecy. And as a result, the concept of revach, the concept of space for disengagement, could not apply to Bilam. When he was in the prophetic mood, he couldn't stop. And once he was out of the prophetic mood, he couldn't get out of whatever he was in. He was a prisoner of whatever mood seized him. And that is why Parshat Bilam is a continuous block of prophecies with no revach bein adveikim, because to Bilam was a split personality. Bilam had aspects of holiness and connection to God when he was in prophetic mode, and then he was a mushchat, then he was a totally perverse person, filled with taiva, filled with lust, filled with arrogance. And when he was in one modality, he could not shift easily to the other modality. His life was discontinuous in that sense. His life was fragmented. His life did not have a structural, integrated integrity. Now, in this sense, I want to mention a very interesting Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos is a little hard to understand, but the Gemara, I'll just quote the Gemara, just tell you what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that Bilam had this amazing talent to curse. Where did he get that great talent? Like, what was his secret? What was the magic that he employed to bring down the curses from God? So the Gemara in Brachos says a strange thing. The Gemara in Brachos says, every single day, there is a fraction of a second where divine fury permeates the world. This is called Eden Riska, Aramaic for a moment of fury. And if you knew when that time was, and you would curse in that particular negative window, the curse would be effective. But we don't know when that time was. Bilam Yada. Bilam knew the Eden Riska, and Bilam was always able to curse during that Eden Riska. Now the Gemara actually tells us there is a way that you can know what time that is. For that fraction of a second, the red comb of a rooster turns white. So the Gemara says Rabbi Meir had enemies that he wanted to curse. And he knew this, so he stayed up all night. He tied a rooster to his chair or bed, and he was staring at the rooster to see that fraction of a second. But lo and behold, it didn't work, because obviously the time that it takes to blink, I mean, most people are going to have to blink, you're going to miss it, and the like. And then he realized that God doesn't want him to do it. And of course his wife Bruria told him, the famous statement of Bruria, it doesn't say sinners should die, it says sins should die. You don't pray for the death of the sinner, you pray for the death of sin by doing tshuva. They should do tshuva and the like. So both this story and Bruria convinced Rabbi Meir that he should change the particular attitude that he had towards evil people. Now, Tosfos asks an obvious question. Given the fact that the Eden Riska is only a fraction of a second, what could Bilam say in that short amount of time that would have been effective? What curse could he get in during that time? It's less than a second. Two answers. Answer number one is, the way the spiritual dynamic works is, as long as you begin your curse within the requisite time, it has an effect even if you finish it after that time. You got it in. It's like, you're trying to get on a bus. Hopefully, if you got your leg in the bus will not drive away. Although there's no guarantee of that, but the hope is, I'm already on, don't drive away without me, or don't drag me along. Now, by the way, in Sifrei Chasidus, they want to bring a proof, although we do not paskin this way. One of the criticisms of many Chasidim is that they don't strictly observe the times for Kriyas Shema and for davening. This was an old concern. So at least one of the early Hasidic Rebbes wanted to say, well, listen, as long as we begin before the time has expired, we could finish even afterwards. And the proof is, because if even with respect to a curse, God says, as long as you begin it in the right time, it'll be effective if it continues afterwards. And we know that God is more liberal with good things than with bad things. So if he allows curses to work that way, he will certainly allow prayers to work that way. Well, notwithstanding the proof, we do not paskin that way. You have to say all of Shema before the expiration of the proper time. So that's answer number one. Meaning, question was, how could Bilam get in his curse if there's such a short window of time? Answer, as long as he began, that's going to be enough. But answer number two is, there is a short one-word curse that you could say in less than a second, and that is the word kalem. Kalem is with a kaf. Kaf lamed mem, kalem, destroy them, kalem. 2 syllables, and that could fit within the Eden Riska, and that was Bilam's point. He knew the exact time, however he knew it, yada lechaven et hasha'ah, and he said kalem. So, there's a beautiful explanation from the Chasam Sofer that really fits the Chavetz Chaim's thought. And I'm elaborating a little bit on what the Chasam Sofer says. And, last week we talked about Korach as a Greek tragedy. And in a way, I'm going to repeat part of the same thoughts, that Bilam is also a Greek tragedy. What do I mean by a Greek tragedy? A Greek tragedy is when the tragedy is not something that is outside of you. If a building falls on a lot of people, kills them, that is sad. But in the Greek definition, that is not tragic. That is sad, and it's awful. But tragedy is when you are destroyed because of a flaw that is within you. Tragedy is when there is potential greatness and nobility. But that nobility and greatness is never realized because there's something that's pulling at the person that never lets them become what they become. Bilam, too, is an example of a tragic figure. On one hand, his prophecy is equated to Moshe Rabbeinu. He is given this phenomenal godlike power to bless and to curse. But that power itself corrupted him, as you see in countless myths and stories. But this is what the Torah is telling us as well. It was the power that corrupted him. Had he been corrupt to begin with, he wouldn't have gotten those powers. Those powers must have come to him because he was, on some level, a righteous person. But being the master of the universe, so to speak, corrupts a person until he's consumed with arrogance, with power, with control, with ego. And that created a tortured human being, a human being who on one hand is aware of his greatness, but he's also aware of those flaws that are enslaving him like a chain, in which he never becomes who he becomes. He's a creature of mood, as I said before. When he's in prophetic mood, he can't disengage. And when he's not in prophetic mood, he has no way of reconnecting. The tragedy of Bilam is that not only was he destroyed by the flaws within, but he was fully aware of that fact. He did not even have the illusory comfort of oblivion. Oblivion has its blessings. Oblivion has its blessings. Ignorance is bliss. Not really, but the sense is, at least if I'm not aware of all that's going on inside of me, at least it's not going to bother me. But Bilam was too smart for that. Bilam was too great for that. Bilam understood that he was great, and he understood he was a train wreck out of control at the same time. Very tragic. A person knows their greatness and knows that they're in the kind of the power, they have a powerlessness, they're in the grip of destructive negative forces that they don't know themselves how to control and how to moderate. So, if Bilam wants to curse a people, from a spiritual perspective, the greatest curse he could give them was, may you be like me. But there's no Yiddish curse like that as well. So here's what the Chassam Sofer says. Again, I'm elaborating somewhat. Kalem, which is a one-word curse, Kalem, destroy them, can actually be Rashi Tevot, abbreviation, for three words. Kalayot, kidneys, Lev, heart, Moach, mind. Now, in tradition, again, this does not fit modern biology that well, but in tradition, the Kalayot are sometimes described as the seat of sexual passion. Lev is emotion, feeling. Moach is the intellectual and moral sense of a human being. The word as a whole means destruction. The greatest destruction that can befall a person is when their intellectual and moral senses are subordinated to their moods, their passions, and feelings, in which essentially the mind is a slave to the passion and the desire. I think about sometimes the entertainment world, the world of popular culture, let's say music, movies. Now the people who make these movies and make these concerts are brilliant, brilliant people. I mean, what they come up with is really quite astounding and quite amazing. But what have they done? Again, I don't mean to generalize everybody, but in many cases at least, they've taken their brilliant mind and they've enslaved it to the service of animalistic passions and drives. And that is called destruction, where the emotion and passion and desire rule and control and direct the mind. So the curse of Kalem is, may you be like me. Because Bilam is aware that that's where he is. Now, fascinatingly enough, if you take the letters of Kalem and you reverse the letters, you get Melech, a king. Who is a king? The Moach, the mind, is Sholet. It rules over the Lev, over the heart, and the passions. And that's a Melech. A Melech is not somebody who rules over other people. Pirkei Avos says, Ezehu Gibor, who is a strong, heroic person, Hakovesh et Yitzra, one who conquers his Yetzer Hara. But it quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, Umoshel berucho miloched ir. He who can rule over his spirit is greater than one who conquers a city. The Chovos HaLevavos brings a famous mashal. When a general came back from conquering an army or conquering a country, and there was a triumphal procession, and everybody were praising the general, throwing confetti. So Chacham went over to the general and said, you have come back from a small war. Now you must deal with the big war. The big war is the war within yourself. That's a much more difficult battle to fight. So, when the Kolayot and the Lev rule over the Moach, Kalem, that is destruction. When the Moach rules over the Lev and the Kolayot, that is being a king over yourself. Now, I do want to clarify one point, because one might take this the wrong way. One might look at this as being an automaton, where all I am is a rational computer. Who was that fellow on the old Star Trek show? Dr. Spock. Right? No emotion, no feeling. I just do things rationally. That is not what I mean, and that is certainly not what the Chassam Sofer means. A Jew must cultivate a life of emotion, a life of feeling, a life of love of Hashem and reverence for Hashem. And that should translate into the relationship of husband and wife and parent and child. It would be the furthest violation of Judaism to kind of live a life devoid of those feelings and those passions. But the Baal HaTanya writes, that's why the Chassidus of Chabad is called Chabad. He was the inventor of Chabad Chassidus. Chabad is an abbreviation for Chachma, Bina, Das, different stages of intellectual understanding. And the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadeh, taught, and we're so far from this idea that maybe we don't always appreciate it, that true and deep emotions can be generated from the mind. He was very suspicious. He was very mistrustful of superficial emotions that just come from external stimuli, like a Karlbach minion or whatever it is. Because he felt, easy come, easy go. You get a high, and that could be spiritual indeed, but then it passes and it doesn't really last. But his position was that through thinking, through meditation, through learning, you can actually unlock within you great and powerful emotions of love and reverence, which come from the intellect. Again, we're so used to the dichotomy between the intellectual and the emotional, we don't realize that at least in that branch of Hasidic thought, the intellectual itself can be connected to deep emotional experiences, which are much more profound than emotional experience that come from the external situation. Now, we sometimes need the external as well, but that would be the equivalent of spiritual junk food. Now, sometimes if you're really starving, you need to get a candy bar. You need to eat it. That'll give you some basic nutrition in the short term. But the long term, you need a better diet. And the deeper diet is that comes from the rational. So I just want to be clear that I do not mean to suggest the absence of emotion in life, but rather the emotion has to be subordinated to the intellectual and moral sense. And that is why you find an extraordinary thing among Gedolim. Again, I go back to the Chofetz Chaim over and over again. When most of us are in one type of mood, it's hard for us to disengage. For example, if we got angry, it takes time for us, even if the person who made us angry is no longer here, and now I have to sit down and sit with my wife or learn with the chavrusa, I'll say something like, I'll be, short of breath, and I'll say, I need 5 minutes to calm down. And that's typically what we do. We're highly agitated. I need a little time to calm down. So it's recorded that there were times when the Chofetz Chaim got angry at something, and as soon as it was finished, the anger went away instantaneously. There was no concept he needed to calm down, he was upset. Because the anger itself was simply a tool that he chose. Now, for whatever reason, he needed to express anger against some sin that was being committed, but it wasn't like a mood that took him over. It was a rational choice that he made. Now is the time to be angry. So I'm going to be angry for 5 minutes because this is what I'm supposed to do. And when those 5 minutes were over, I said, okay, I'm going to put the anger away to be used sparingly when it is next necessary to be employed. That's an example of the emotion coming from the intellect. There are intellectual, moral decisions as to which emotion is appropriate. That's a very foreign idea. We look at emotions as this runaway train that takes us over, when in fact it can come from the intellect itself. That is the yesod of Chabad Hasidus. In fact, one has to realize this. Historically, it's very, very fascinating that the Alter Rebbe was very controversial, not only vis-a-vis Misnagdim, those who were opposed to Hasidus. He was very controversial vis-a-vis other groups of Hasidim. Now, to this day, Lubavitch is a little controversial, but for totally different reasons. That's the Mashiach business. That's a separate, later development. But I'm talking about as a school of philosophy. Chabad was quite revolutionary because, it's kind of like the Kotzker Rebbe used to say, when you walk in the middle of the road, you get hit with traffic coming from both sides. And that really was the problem with Chabad, because non-Chabad Hasidus emphasized emotional states of ecstasy. The Misnagdim emphasized learning and mitzvos and did not talk about emotional states. They mistrusted it. The Alter Rebbe tried to create a mizug, a integration of the Litvisha emphasis on mitzvos and Torah learning and the Hasidic emphasis on ecstasy by basically saying states of ecstasy come from Torah learning, meditation, and prayer. And as a result, the Misnagdim were a little suspicious of him and the Hasidim were a little suspicious of him, because it really was a mizug. And that's why classical Chabad is the Hasidus that is closest to non-Hasidus. Actually, it was the closest. And that's why, again, if you're a student of the Nefesh HaChaim of Rav Chaim Volozhiner's book, who was disciple of the Vilna Gaon, there are so many similarities between Nefesh HaChaim and Tanya. In fact, the Nefesh HaChaim came out after the Tanya. It was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's claim that Rav Chaim Volozhiner was influenced by Tanya in incorporating his own ideology. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is very, very true that the Litvisha Misnaged ideology of Rav Chaim Volozhin is extremely close to the Hasidisha ideology of the Baal Tanya. And it's also true that Tanya was published first. So if there is any influence, if there is, the influence would be from the Alter Rebbe to Rav Chaim rather than vice versa. Again, very, very fascinating. I happen to give a shir in both Tanya and Nefesh HaChaim, and at least there are weeks in which I give the same shir twice. I'm learning two different texts, and I literally repeat the shir. So when people ask me for recordings, I say, if you got the Tanya shir, you don't need this one. It's the same. It was the same shir. Not every week, but there are weeks in which it is mamash the same shir. Okay, but be it as it may, therefore, that's the idea of melech and the idea of kalem. And once again, there's a poignancy. You feel bad for the bad guys in Tanakh. I feel sorry for Esav, and feel sorry for Korach, and I feel sorry for Bilam, because that really is the idea of a Greek tragedy is a very powerful, tragic dimension in which there is so much greatness, there is so much potential, and yet there is a weakness that the person just cannot break out of, that ultimately destroys him, and he doesn't even have the blessing, quotation mark, of being oblivious to his own weakness. He knows it, and it kills him, and that is why the best or the worst curse he could think of is to say, you should have the same thing. Yeah.
If Bilam is a personality from Greek tragedy, doesn't that require us to identify his tragic flaw?
Well, Pirkei Avos identifies three flaws within Bilam, and these are general flaws. It talks about ayin ra'ah. Ayin ra'ah means an evil eye. That means he begrudges the good fortune of others, because he sees life as a zero-sum game. Anyone that has something is something he doesn't have. It's called ruach gavoa, which is arrogance, gaiva, and nefesh rechava, which is hedonism, an unbridled desire for more wealth, more power. These are the flaws. These are generic flaws, but these are the flaws that Bilam is said to have had. Now, one other thing, let me just say a very quick thought, and again, this actually deserves a share of its own. Perhaps I will expand on it next week. That is, Bilam, of course, wanted to curse, but God changed all of his curses into great blessings, and some of those blessings have found their way in our siddur. A lot of it don't say it, but the beginning of Shachrit is when you walk into the shul. The very first thing in the siddur is Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenosecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Yisrael. A praise of the Jewish home, of the modesty, of the holiness, of the goodness. Those words are none other than the words of Bilam, who wanted to curse, and God changed it into a blessing. Now, it's interesting that the Rambam and all of the Rishonim actually see in Bilam's statements many prophetic references to Mashiach. When Bilam says, for example, Arenu, I see them, v'lo ata, but not now. Ashurenu, I gaze at them, v'lo karov, but not in the near future. Bilam, this is his final prophecy, is having a vision, this is what the Rambam writes, of Acharis Hayamim, the end of days. And there is much in Bilam's prophecy that is a reference to Mashiach. And I want to share with you a thought of the Or HaChaim, who says an amazing thing. The Or HaChaim was Rav Chaim ben Attar from Morocco, who came to Eretz Yisrael. His yahrzeit, do we have his yahrzeit is in Tammuz? I think it's towards the end of Tammuz. So it's a big yahrzeit. It's Har Hazeisim, and tens of thousands of people go to the Or HaChaim's kever. And he lived in the 1700s. So way before Zionism and way before the State of Israel. And he points out the following. Bilam says, I see them, but not now. And he says, Darach kochav mi Yaakov. A star shall arise from Jacob. V'kam shevet, and a staff from Israel. And they will smite the enemies. So this is a reference to Mashiach, the Or HaChaim says. But the question is, why are there two verses, or two phrases? A star will arise from Jacob, and a staff will arise from Israel. Both of them are referring to Mashiach. What is the double parallelism? By the way, the idea of the star being Mashiach, that is why Rabbi Akiva called Shimon ben Koziva Bar Kochba, the son of a star, because Rabbi Akiva believed, it turned out to be erroneously, Rabbi Akiva believed that Bar Kochba was the Mashiach. Of course, that ended in immense tragedy, but that was Rabbi Akiva's belief. We can debate, was Rabbi Akiva wrong, or was Bar Kochba a potential Mashiach, and the generation messed up? That's always a question, but be it as it may, that is the name Bar Kochba, coming from Darach Kochav. So here's what the Ohr HaChaim says. The process of Geula can come two ways for the Jewish people. If we are righteous and holy, Mashiach will come through a supernatural process. It'll come through miracles. And that miracle is like a kochav, a star. But if we're not righteous, it may come by an old man hobbling on a cane or riding on a donkey, or the shevet is using a crutch, through a laborious process of political and social and military upheavals, in which sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back. It'll be a laborious, gradual process with many difficulties and much suffering. The Geula has 2 different pathways. There is the pathway of the supernatural, and there is the pathway of the gradual, painful, laborious process. One is called the Kochav, and the one is called the Shevet. These words are truly, truly remarkable, because in the 19th century, way after the Ohr HaChaim, when Zionism began as a political movement, and when eventually the State of Israel was established in 1948, or let's say before the state, people like Rav Kook would describe the state as or the potential state, or the return of the Jews to Israel, whatever point you want to pick, as a stage in Geula, a stage in redemption, a stage in a process that will culminate with Mashiach. Now, a lot of the people who did not accept that ideology said and say today, there is no way Medinat Yisrael could be Reishit Tzmichat Gulatenu. There's no way. Because number one, so much of the founding fathers and mothers of the state were not only non-religious, but they were anti-religious in some ways. The state itself is largely secular. We still have wars. I thought the Messianic era is supposed to usher in peace. How could something be a tahalich of Geula if there is loss of Jewish life and war and suffering and terrorism? How could that be Geula? And therefore it's not Geula. That was the counter-conclusion. What is fascinating is the Ohr HaChaim gives us a key to addressing those problems. Because the Ohr HaChaim says there is the Geula of Kochav, which is this sudden, miraculous redemption. The lion lies down with the lamb, or the wolf lies down with the lamb. But then there's another type of Geula, which is gradual, painful, laborious, limping. The shevet is meant, the Ohr HaChaim says, as a cane or a crutch. Or another verse in Zechariah talks about the ani, the poor man riding on the donkey. And therefore, the fact that we still have war, and the fact that so much of the Jews in Israel are not yet committed to the Torah, now again, I don't say that proves Geula, but all I'm saying is it doesn't negate Geula, because there is a path of Geula that may follow a torturous, unknown road leading to culmination. So the Ohr HaChaim's dichotomy, as seen in the prophecy of Bilam, is very, very fascinating, because it has a resonance to the events that we are going through since 1948 and up to the present day. And therefore, this would at least permit the assumption that this is a Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, this is part of God's redemptive process to create redemption. And in many ways, I think the Vilna Gaon himself subscribed to this ideology. We know that there are two Mashiachs, right? There's the Mashiach ben David, and then there's the Mashiach ben Yosef. And the Vilna Gaon writes amazingly, and again, this really deserves a whole talk, that Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't have to be a person. It could be an ideology. And this Mashiach ben Yosef represents the movement to get the Jews physically back in the land of Israel. And by getting the Jews physically back in the land of Israel, that will bring Mashiach ben David, the Beis HaMikdash, and everything else. So instead of the idea, we'll come back when Mashiach comes, the lesson is the opposite. Come back, and that will bring the coming of the Mashiach. As a result, therefore, the idea that Zionism itself may be a stage in the redemption of the Jewish people can find some support, even in the writings of the Vilna Gaon, not just Rav Kook, and you could trace it to even earlier than the Vilna Gaon, that's the Or HaChaim HaKadosh. Okay, you have a good Shabbos and a good day.
Yiboneh